Give me money, give me money, give me money, give me money, give me money.
I'm on record as being vocally against critics using the term Mary Sue, and in recent months, many people have been getting confused by that considering that I have several entire glass of water scripts dedicated to dissecting the concept of a Mary Sue in rather extensive detail. So lately, there have been a number of vocal detractors, real detractors, not limbo detractors, who are confused that I could hate a term that I clearly understand in great detail. Well, my little pubic louse, let me draw your attention to the tail end of Snap Crackle Fizzle Pop. Most people understand that villains with tragic backstories can be good, but they're not willing to put in the effort to understand why they're good. So they take shortcuts and just assume that villains who have tragic backstories are automatically better than the Saturday morning cartoon villain. We saw this with early reception of Starlight Glimmer. The best villains are the ones that kind of have a point, and after uttering that phrase, they immediately shut their brain off and didn't consider whether or not she actually did have a point. I've been battling this abuse of critical shortcuts for the last several years, and it frustrates me that I can't fully articulate how much contempt I have for such loud and critically lazy people being able to influence a series the way they do. Mary Sue is a critical shortcut, a handy buzzword with a list of symptoms that you can easily diagnose for a quick and simple test of whether or not a character is bad. The critical spectrum is loaded with shortcut tests to avoid having to do the actual work, the Bechdel test being the most notorious. A joke about how something as simple as two women talking about something other than a man was apparently so hard to find in the entirety of Hollywood was twisted into a test of individual films as an easy way for idiots to decide if it was technically feminist or not. Mary Sue follows the same concept, being a way for people to determine the quality of a character in a way that doesn't actually help you, the writer, or anybody else. It's meaningless jargon on its own. TV Tropes has an entire thesis written on the concept because that's how much elaboration the term inherently requires in order for people to get it. As a result, in any critical discussion about a character, it would be more valuable to just use the explanation that suits the character and drop the jargon entirely. If you know why a character is a Mary Sue, then just fucking say that. This also isn't helped by the fact that Mary Sue is overwhelmingly applied to female self-insert fanfiction characters, aka the one kind of character for which it is okay to have zero standards of quality for. Personally, I've never been much into shitting on what teenage girls like and what they fantasize about, so if some kid wants to write a story about being irresistible to Captain Kirk or Sephiroth or Kylo Ren or whoever it is teenage girls like, fuck, I feel old, then honestly I think trying to apply quality standards to them is just you being the fun police, especially when it's shitty quality standards that wouldn't hold up in any writing class. You see, like all umbrella terms, Mary Sue often erroneously places the blame on bad character design and tries to set up a list of criteria for good character design, but anyone who has read literally any story ever will know that the most popular works in all of Western canon flagrantly break this criteria at every possible opportunity. Poorly written character? Hello, Luke. Cliched character? Hello, every chosen one ever, and every hero's journey ever, and every man ever. Author avatar? Hello, Kreia. Idealized character? Hello, vast majority of male protagonists that aren't edgy white boys. Power fantasy? Hello, entire Eastern animation industry. Infallible character who isn't allowed to be wrong despite constantly being wrong? Hello, Old Testament Jehovah. Now, it's worth pointing out that I don't necessarily like all of those characters. Some of those characters I fucking hate. But to boil detailed deconstructions of these characters, and in that last case, entire schools of philosophy down to just two words is just bad criticism. Historically speaking, characters that closely resemble a Mary Sue have one key problem that isn't even related to the character's design itself. Namely, they go unchallenged by the plot. It's not a character problem, it's a story problem. A novice writer has dropped a character into the world that is overwhelmingly capable, and the conflict of the story is not balanced around that. Hence, the character is able to run around chopping the heads off gods with absolutely nobody thinking such a thing is out of place. This could happen in a number of different ways and for a number of different reasons. To give a few familiar examples, in Friendship is Magic, Starlight Glimmer frequently has the plot around her kneecapped and other characters mysteriously captured so she can save the day and prove that she is the most specialist of ponies, because the writers really hate the fact that viewers don't like her and will try to force people to love her. In Star Wars, Revan was a conduit of Force energy who walked the path of the Jedi and the Sith and repeatedly returned from the dead, and whom every other character talked about in reverent tones about how amazing and special he was, and really he's just so cool, you guys.
You think you're the only Jedi who's ever fallen. You're one of thousands, Revan, and you're more deluded than most.
In The Legend of Korra's Garbage and Here's Why, I briefly touched on the fact that Korra is shown bending 3 of the 4 elements at a very early age, seemingly for no other reason than because a little Babu bending multiple elements is funny, and then immediately fades in on her as an adult training in a compound and offering a better explanation for her initial mastery of the 3 elements. The people who claim Korra is a Mary Sue on the basis of this initial scene are comically missing the point of why this scene exists, because it's funny. And it seems for all of their failings, Bright knew this because they time jumped away from it once the fun scene was over, and cries of Korra being a Mary Sue on the basis of this scene are showing the failings with the term. Mary Sue was originally designed for fanfiction circles, so forums already familiar with the lingo itself could easily tell other people what stories were worth reading. It was intended to be used by people already in the know to save themselves some time, because as much as I understand teenagers writing wish fulfillment fantasies, I also understand that communities want to be able to sift past that to get to something they would actually like instead. But that's the problem with jargon. All of this slides off a person's brain, but a buzzword with a half-sentence definition is easily remembered. And so what happened was lazy people started using it. A term meant to describe wish fulfillment characters who were unchallenged by the plot came to be given to characters that were important at all. See, here's the thing about fanfiction in general. The people who read fanfiction and the people who write fanfiction are often two very different groups with little overlap. While someone who writes fanfiction might want to play with new ideas or deconstruct certain elements of the original work or just make everyone fuck because lol, the people who read fanfiction often want little more than more content. They're using fanfiction as supplementary material for the actual show, and original characters are a contentious element specifically because they get in the way of what some deem a pure experience. So an original character doesn't even need to be absurdly powerful or unchallenged by the story to be deemed a Mary Sue by idiots, they just need to be prominent. If the story is about them, or the reader's favorite character isn't present enough, out comes the jargon. And heaven fucking forfend you dare have a main character be beaten in a fight by the original character, oh lord, the crying for days. In fact, I've actually cracked jokes about this. In The Siege of Canterlot, a book I've been chipping away at in between work for several years now, the main cast is comprised of about 60% original characters, with Twilight and Luna being the only prominent canon characters in a protagonist role. The story is a huge deconstruction of Fall of Equestria, a terribly written alternate universe where Equestria has been supplanted by a patriarchal dictatorship and only exists to be porn for misogynistic bronies. Anyway, in The Siege of Canterlot, there's one instance where the main villain is bragging about his divine right to rule granted by his penis or whatever, and how this is demonstrated by the fact that he successfully dethroned Celestia. One of the deuteragonists, character of my own creation, who is demonstrably more powerful than 100 deities, casually points out that the only reason Stonehoof wasn't turned into a red smear on the floor is because Celestia is such a stubborn pacifist who would rather surrender than turn to violence, simultaneously being a criticism of the thinly written misogynistic propaganda it's actively deconstructing and the anti-violence extremism of the original work itself. In fact, such absurdly powerful characters only exist in the story to create a Die-Hard effect, where it's apparent right from the word go that the good guys are absolutely going to win because they've got an army of amoral monsters backing them, and the majority of the story is dedicated to dialogue and character work because Ryder doesn't want to stay on Equestria once this is over, and so it's important to figure out why Stonehoof was able to happen in the first place and make sure it won't happen again. AKA, the story is written with the absurdly powerful god killers in mind. Yes, they could just snap their fingers and end the entire war, but because the underlying philosophical failings of the country that allowed this to happen in the first place is still there, that only ends up being detrimental. As a result, they have to fight that war the slow way in order to break years of psychological conditioning. So by all reasonable critical measures, these characters are not Mary Sue's because they don't break the story is built so they will fit. But that doesn't matter. They can beat up your favorite characters, which means they definitely are in the minds of the kind of people who actually read and comment on a fanfic instead of just write one, and that's kind of the problem. Was the best example you could come up with to make your point really a half-finished 400-page string of Twilight getting hit across the head with a newspaper by a low-rent Darth Malgus? Well, I mean, I'm sure if I crawled through fanfiction for a few hours, I'd find a better one people can actually read, but fuck no, I'm not doing that. I got places to go, people to see, so fuck it, I'll just use my own. One of the most damaging blows the internet has done to criticism is amplifying the voices of your average fan to be on the same level as professional or even semi-professional critics. This means that to a creator, the people who don't know what they're talking about are just as visible as the people who do. And when the former is actively using jargon created by the latter in a way that was never intended, this means almost all criticism is bled together into a big blinding blob. The sole counter to this is that the people who know how to analyze stories and characters have recognized the uselessness of terms like Mary Sue and have actively stopped using it, instead opting to just explain bad character and story design the long way. But the term itself is still very attractive to a lot of people, well, for about the same reason that the like and dislike system is so attractive to people. It makes a point for you. You might be able to vaguely think about why you don't like a certain character, but unpacking that and thinking about it is too hard, and this term that's already there is just easier. You don't even need to understand it, you just need to vaguely understand a list of symptoms and away you go. The term is intended to jog your brain and get you thinking about how characters relate to the story they're used in, but instead people use it as an excuse not to think. I've heard people make that defense of the term, that sometimes you don't want to go really in depth as to why something is bad, and having a convenient term to use saves a lot of time. But here's the key failing. You're not obligated to give your opinion on something, and if you're too lazy to explain what the fuck you're on about, you could just not comment. The fact is that using jargon with such a broad sweeping meaning and refusing to explain yourself only muddies the waters of your criticism and ultimately makes your feedback completely useless because it means the creator has to expend more energy than is reasonably necessary trying to figure out what you actually mean and whether or not you're talking out of your ass, and in 90% of cases it's generally more economical to just delete your comment and move on to the next one. Like any piece of jargon, it's ultimately a red flag that tells people you're too lazy to actually think about the work you're consuming, yet for some reason you feel like your opinion needs to be heard anyway. There's this weird compulsive need for some people on the internet to always give their 2 cents on every single discussion regardless of their ability to understand it. This is the reason so many self-proclaimed critics and analysts can give such banal and empty critique that just sounds like they're repeating 1,000 buzzwords and platitudes and passing that off as an essay. They want to weigh in and give their opinion, but they don't know shit, so they have to improvise. It's the reason most of the brony analysis community just repeats the same criticisms over and over again, but it can be found in any community that centers around critical analysis in some way. Unfortunately, the internet's violent opposition to the idea of quality control or barriers to entry means that being able to determine which criticism is valuable and which is just some idiot listening to themselves talk is a skill that creators now have to hone and perfect. Fuck, I hate the internet.